let us say Shehecheyanu, and let's get into the Purim spirit, ready to celebrate Purim this week, please God. What I want to talk with you about is something a little bit interesting. Some of you were around in the 60s and 70s when perhaps there was a little bit of upheaval. And I'm not talking about Soweto riots, and I'm not talking about those kind of things. I'm talking about the hippie movement. Were you around in those days? Oh, yes. Who here was a hippie? Were you all hippies? Did you all have a nice l'chaim? Okay. Yes, same era. But I was not around back then, so I can't talk about it. But as long as you could all see. Now, we talked last week about a lot about Purim, and we'll connect it to the hippie movement as well. Purim is perhaps the most joyous Jewish holiday that we have, right? Maybe Ronnie remembers a song from the old days. Madua lo bopurim pamayim bashavua la 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 la. We ask, why can't we get Purim a little bit more often, a little bit more regularly? We would love to have Purim more frequently. Who wouldn't want Purim every day, right? Celebrate. That's life. We want to celebrate. So what is Purim celebrating? Our salvation from destruction, which is the story of our history. How many times has it happened over and over again in our history where they tried to destroy us, where they tried to annihilate us, where they tried to eliminate us, whether it was expulsion from our land, whether it was inquisitions or crusades, pogroms or holocausts, one after another. Exactly, we're going to say as we get ready for Pesach, B'chol dar vadar, in every generation, they tried this, and we have to realize this is the miraculous story of Jewish history. It's beyond our comprehension. Haman, wicked Haman, he thought that when he cast his lots, that's what Purim means. If you think about all the other holidays, they have a Jewish name. And usually the name reflects the salvation. Pesach, God skipped over the Jewish homes in the final plane. Shavuos, we counted 7 weeks to receive the Torah. Rosh Hashanah, symbolic of the head of the year. Yom Kippur is a day of atonement. Sukkot, the God protected us under His protective wings. Right? The Ananiah covered the clouds of glory. Chanukah is about the rededication of the temple. It's all about the miracle. Purim is not about the miracle. Purim, actually, its name reflects the how would you call it? The negativity. That's what Purim is symbolic of. Purim means lots. Haman cast lots to destroy us, to eliminate us, to annihilate us, to make us extinct. And yet, what do we see? He chose the month of Adar, or rather he said, I won't choose the day. Let God, let fate. And when it picked the month of Adar, he said, that's when their leader died. Moshe Rabbeinu passed away in the month of Adar, 7th of Adar. But little did he realize that Moshe Rabbeinu also was born on the 7th of Adar. And I think this is symbolic to us of the whole story of Jewish history, of our fate, that we have our ups and downs. The very same time, there's annihilation on the horizon, there's also the blessings of a greater future, of a much brighter future. And so, on Purim, one of the mitzvahs is that we are obligated to eat and to drink and to be merry, to be happy. We discussed the 4 mitzvahs of Purim to remind us again. It's 4 M's. One is Megillah. The first thing we're going to do is hear the Megillah. Then we're going to have a nice festive meal. We're going to give mishloach manot, gifts to our friends, to create camaraderie and friendship, to reverse, to challenge the words of Haman. Haman said, Yeshnam echad mefuzar mefara ben amim. There's this one people that are scattered, that are spread, that are faribel, that are fighting with each other. Well, we are going to refute that by showing that we give gifts to each other. And matanot levyonim, giving charity to the poor. The 4 M's. And so this is a very, very Jewish holiday. Now the truth is though, while eating and drinking are certainly a staple of every Jewish holiday, Purim takes the revelry to a whole new level. As we know, In the Gemara, there's a very interesting statement. I want to read it to you from the Gemara and discuss this. Amar Rava. The Gemara tells us the great sage Rava stated, Mechayev inish lebesuma bepuria. Can you translate that? It's not Hebrew exactly, it's Aramaic. It's the language of the Gemara. That on Purim, it is the duty of every person to imbibe themselves with wine, to get intoxicated. Until you can't tell the difference, the distinction between Arar Haman. It's vodka. It's fine, don't worry, leave it. You know, I saw a man in a restaurant one day. He was holding a cup of whiskey and toasting to his wife. He says, wow, on our 30th wedding anniversary, I want to toast to L'chaim. He says, 30 years, I couldn't get by without you. 30 years, you got me through the difficult times, through the pleasant times, through the loving times. You were my savior. You were my, and he's going on all this romanticism. And his wife says, darling, is it you talking or the whiskey talking? He says, no, it's me talking to the whiskey. Yeah. So the Gemara says, or Rava is telling us in the Gemara, on Purim you got to drink. You have to say L'chaim until you don't know the difference between blessed is Haman and cursed is Mordechai. God forbid. The reverse. You see, I don't know already. Perhaps I could say something else. If you look in the Megillah, you'll notice the top of every page starts with the word Hamelech, the king. And to take this idea of Ad Lo Yada, perhaps we could say it another way. Another idea and insight is Ad Lo Yada on Purim, you shouldn't know the difference. You should realize Ad Lo Yada, I don't know. It all comes from Hashem. The world is filled of pain and difficulties and suffering and sadness and challenges and war and destruction and darkness and load shedding and there's a problem. And COVID, there's an uptick of cases in China. I don't know if that means and no water. Yeah, we got all these problems. What are we going to do? No water, no electricity. Oy vey. So Adal Yada, we realize who's in control of the world. Who is the boss? That is what we have to be realizing. So this is what the Gemara tells us. You have to get so intoxicated on Purim that you can't tell the difference. What does it mean that you can't tell the difference? Says the Gemara story. You want to hear? Rabbah and Rab Zera joined together. Listen to this peculiar little story. They were having a Purim party, these two great sages, Rabbah and Rab Zera. And they were fulfilling this obligation of Ad Lo Yada, that they got so intoxicated that they couldn't tell the difference between blessed as Mordechai, cursed as Haman, or as I explained in Ad Lo Yada, until you realize that you don't know, that it's beyond our comprehension. Well, listen to what happens at this Purim feast in Babylon, in Iraq. Not amongst two Iraqis. This is not with Saddam Hussein's crew. This is two great, illustrious Jewish sages, Rabbah and Rab Zera. Says the Gemara, come Rabbah. Rabbah got so drunk, you know what he did? Shachtel Rab Zera. He took out a knife and he cut Rab Zera. Now, this is what the Gemara says. Lemachar boi rachme v'achi. And the next day, he prayed on his behalf and revived him. Now, I don't know if the Gemara is saying they literally slaughtered and murdered his friend and now prayed for his friend to be revived, for resurrection. Or if he hurt his friend, he cut him, and now he prayed for his healing. Either way, it's bad, right? The next year, Lashana Cheres, Amalei, his friend said to him, will you honor me and come and have Purim together with me? Rabbah says, come Rab Zera, come to my Purim party. So you know what Rab Zera said? I don't count the miracles twice. Last year you got out of hand. I'm not gonna, not coming to you. Sorry. But let me ask you, what's the Gemara telling us here? Is the Gemara really want to tell us a story about violence? That two sages, listen, I can tell you a story about another rabbi, he's president of the building. He had a l'chaim with me once, and we clinked glasses, and the glass is still sitting in my wrist right here. I won't say who, okay? Things happen. So you think I'm not going to be careful about having my l'chaims with such, right? The next time he invites me for l'chaim, hey, Rabbi. So Reb Zera, exactly. Reb Zera is saying, listen, Rabbi, last year, you know what you did to me when you got drunk? I don't want to have another drunk party with you this Purim. But let me really ask you, my friends. We know that the Torah is filled with plenty of stories, perhaps telling. Can I ask a favor, whoever's making noise there? No, I understand, but they could tone the noise down because we have a shear here. We're on YouTube. Good, thank you, Malcolm. So, I understand that the Torah, that the Bible's filled with stories of the imperfections of our ancestors. Okay, it makes sense why these stories are there, to teach us that there are lessons we can learn from them. Even the story of Adam and Eve, that they, on their very first day in this world, they violated the will of God. I mean, what does it say? That we're doomed. But the Torah obviously has lessons and messages to learn from it. And the fact that the Torah tells us the stories, even Avram and Sarah were idol worshippers before they became the great patriarchs and matriarchs of the Jewish people. And whether it's the shortcomings of Moshe Rabbeinu, great Moses, or King David and Bathsheba, and how many other stories. It's not to poke at them, but it's to show us that look what when they were able to do teshuvah, to repent, to change from their ways. It's lessons for life for us. But what's this story of Rabbah and Reb Zera and the Gemara on Purim? Have you ever heard the story before? Now, here's a very interesting thing. The Gemara tells us that we have to be so inebriated on Purim that you can no longer discern between the most basic distinctions. And this story is shocking. So the question obviously is, in Yiddish they say, was kommt davor? What's going on here? How could there be what seems to be an endorsement for intoxication? And this actually has been a pet peeve, I know, of some people in the community. I haven't seen it yet this year, the campaigns. But in previous years, I would see a campaign the week before Purim to promote awareness that people should not get so drunk. The Gemara seems to be saying you should get out of your mind. Which one is it? Until you can't tell the difference between cursed as Haman and blessed as Mordechai. What does that mean? Why did the sages of the Talmud choose such a peculiar way of describing how intoxicated we should be? We have many Jewish festivals, and certainly the Talmud tells us on all holidays that we should be happy, we should be merry, we should be joyous, and the Gemara even gives examples. That in the halacha it says that when Yom Tov comes around, Pesach is a month away, start planning now. The Gemara says that the men should buy jewelry for their wives, and sweets and treats for the kids, and new clothing. There are ways of being joyous. Nowhere does it say regarding any other holiday that we should get drunk. Intoxication, imbibing with wine. Why would it be considered a good thing that you should be so drunk that you can't tell the difference between the evils of Haman and the virtues of Mordechai? Right? Shouldn't we always know the difference between such things? In general, these days you look at the news, and what do the headlines tell you? In general, I used to own a newspaper. Let me tell you, the general rule of the press is, if it bleeds, it leads. So they're always going to use these sensational headlines. And they're always going to tell you what's happening. And the truth is, probably, I don't think any war in history did we get such a bird's eye view of the inside of what's going on there. It's unbelievable. But why is it that the negativity overcomes us? And the truth is, I would say, we should focus more on the good. As much as we boo wicked, evil Haman, we should focus more on Esther and Mordechai. Focus on the heroes, not on the villains. But here the Gemara seems to be misconstruing things, telling us that you don't know the difference between good and bad. So due to this extremely puzzling nature of this statement from the Gemara, there's many commentaries that give us various interpretations, and I want to read a few of them to you that I have on my phone here. Okay? Says one, this is the Avudraham, a very famous 14th century commentator on the Talmud, and he says, quoting the Gemara Megillah, that you have to be so drunk on Purim. So he says, some explain that the words cursed be Haman have the same numerical value as blessed be Mordechai. We know that gematria is numerology, is a means of interpretation. There are many ways of understanding and interpreting and learning the Torah. Gematria is one of those ways where we play with numerology. Now, anyone here want to do the maths? I didn't check. But probably if you're starting to do the checking, then you're not drunk enough. So says the Avudraham, the Talmud wishes to tell us that a person should be married. Just a second, guys, it's a security company calling us. Just a second, hello? All right, it wasn't an emergency. That's why I told them to call back later. Just there was the security company, maybe there's some emergency at the shul, I don't know. So says the Avudraham, the Talmud wants to tell us that a person should be married to the extent that you can no longer make that calculation. So does the calculation add up? I don't know, I didn't check. But that's what he says. And he goes on further. He says the Talmud is referring to a certain poem written in a responsive format. For every stanza, the refrain would be either blessed Baruch Mordechai, blessed be Mordechai, or Ar Haman, cursed be Haman. It's an alternating order of this poem that was traditional to be read on Purim. Now, one would need a clear head to keep track, to follow along, right? Because if you're not paying close attention, then you can make a mistake and say the wrong refrain. Are you saying blessed be Haman, cursed is Mordechai? Which one? So put simply, the Talmud is making a simple reference. Say hello, everyone. Hello. Hello, everybody. So simply put, the Talmud is making a very simple reference to either a number game, says the Avudraham, or to this poem that they used to say on Purim. Now, what are we getting from this? Where is this taking us? What's this all about, my friends? What the Talmud is telling us is, you might drink to the point that you are having l'chaims, but we want you, loosen up a bit. You don't have to be so sophisticated to make these calculations or to be singing the poems, okay? Just relax. Celebrate. Stop being so calculated. You get a little tipsy. Get into the spirit of the holiday. Yeah, chill out. Take off that tie. Relax. Chillax. But that's just one way. You don't want to see the difference between cursed is Haman, blessed is Mordechai. But do we really not want to know the difference between good and evil? Is that really the case? Like I said, as much as the headlines are about all the negative, about the horrible news going on out there, war, destruction, we have to be focused on the heroes, not on the villains. So, I think we still need to get an understanding. I understand that it's telling us loosen up a bit. But I want to get a better understanding of what this means. There's got to be other ideas. And so another commentary I saw was the Ramah. The Ramah is the gloss of the Shulchan Aruch. I've told you before, his name was Rabbi Moshe Isserles. He wrote a code of Jewish law at the same time as Rabbi Yosef Cairo wrote it in Tzfat in Israel. The Rama, Rabbi Moshe Isserles, wrote this in Krakow in Poland. And when he received the Shulchan, that Rabbi Yosef Cairo called it the Shulchan Aruch, which means the set table. So he wrote back, imagine in those days, not by email, not by WhatsApp. He wrote back, he sent back a letter. He said, you sent me the set table. Now I will send you the mappa, the tablecloth. Okay, so that's what he called it, the tablecloth. That was his commentary, the tablecloth. It wasn't really a commentary. It was Jewish law written at the same time. And that's sort of where you have the difference between Ashkenaz and Sephardic customs. Rabbi Yosef Karo was a Sephardic rabbi from Spain, living in Tzfat in the Holy Land after the expulsion. And Rabbi Moshe Isserles was a European rabbi living in Poland. And the differences between them is where you have the difference between Ashkenaz and Sephardic customs. I wonder what the differences are between Ashkenaz and Sephardic customs for Purim. But when it comes to Pesach, we know there's many such differences. For example, we Ashkenazim do not eat any kitniot, any legumes on Pesach. Rani could eat rice, beans, hummus. Do you? It's not a problem for you two because for your custom, for your tradition.
Yeah, I don't want to offend that.
Oh, you don't want to offend people, okay? Obviously, there's many customs. We'll get to all that stuff before Pesach. The point is, says the Ramah. Let me read it to you. Yes, he says, actually, don't take it so literally. You don't have to get so inebriated, so drunk. Rather, you should drink more than you're used to, more than you're accustomed to. And then eventually you'll farbrang. Eventually you'll fall asleep. And while you're sleeping, he says, you won't be able to tell the difference between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. Ay, 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 ay. Regardless, he says, if you increase, in your drinking on Purim, then don't lose your mind. Don't get so tipsy. He puts in the warning. Do it for the sake of heaven. And if you're going to do it for the sake of heaven, you won't get drunk as some others might be accustomed to. You don't usually see a Jew in the bar. We Jews like to drink with each other if we're going to do it. That's why the word mayim, water, has one yud. A Jew, when he's drinking alone, drinks water or virgin beverages. Yayin and lechayim have two yuds. Only when you get together with another yid do you drink some whiskey, some wine. You say lechayim. But I think what the Ramah is telling us, the point is, he's not saying that you should drink. He's saying he's a shlafner. I think in Europe it was cold and wet and miserable. So for many of us, even a glass of wine makes us a bit drowsy. Okay, I drink a glass of wine every Friday night and every Shabbos day. All right, let me tell you, there's some guys in my shul who know how to hold their cups. But you could say that for some people, a little bit of wine, a little bit of whiskey makes them already tired. But the question that comes to mind is, he's not taking the words of the Talmud very seriously. Okay? The Talmud seems to say pretty clear. Chayiv, inish, before the Gemara is saying that on Purim you should get intoxicated. You should get silly drunk. So how is the Ramah interpreting it? Not so literally. So another commentary, the Taz says, this that Rabbah says in the Gemara, that you should get so drunk, till you can't tell the difference. What does this mean? He says, therefore, we are forced to explain Zukivan shebegemara mevi al zed de Rabba shachte the Rabzera. The fact is, the Gemara follows it with a story. First, the Gemara says you should get drunk. But then the Gemara follows it with the story of a rabbi who got so drunk that he cut his friend. So therefore, the Talmud is telling you what not to do. Don't get so drunk that you're going to, God forbid, cause trouble. So the Taz, the Turei Zav, another very famous commentary, again, 15th, 16th century halachist, and the Turei Zahav, his name was Rabbi David Halevi Segal. And he very skillfully goes on to describe how basically he's killing two birds with one stone. He explains the Ramah's position. And along the way, he explains why the Talmud tells us as much as you should get drunk on Purim, the Talmud throws in this bizarre story about Rabbah and Rab Zera, that Rabbah shachte the Rab Zera, that he cut his friend. And he's saying, in his opinion, the Talmud specifically brings this story to prove to us that as drunk as you should get, don't lose your mind that you're going to hurt your friend. By the way, I've seen it, that sometimes people get a little bit too drunk and it could be unpleasant, their behavior. So the Taz is telling us, you know why the Gemara tells the story right next to telling us about intoxication is to forewarn. Yes, you should get a little tipsy and get out of your comfort zone. That's all important. Drink a little schnapps, gesundheit, but make sure that you don't get so crazy that you're going to hurt your friend. Okay? Take care of your differentiating capabilities, that you know the difference between the two. But let's try to get a deeper understanding of what this means. Okay? While the commentaries are giving us explanations, whether it's literal or non-literal, to understand what the Talmud is telling us, that we have to get so drunk on Purim, the fact remains that a simple reading of the Gemara statement that Rava says that you have to get drunk, what does this mean? What does it mean? Is the Gemara promoting, endorsing intoxication? At the end of the day, and one more thing, I want to just use the example that Rava gives. Until you don't know the difference between cursed as Haman and blessed as Mordechai. Haman was a ruthless power monger, a Hitler of his time. In fact, he was the original Hitler. He had the final solution, down packed better than Hitler did, how he was going to annihilate every single Jew, ultimate extinction of every Jewish man, woman, and child. So he was a self-centered egomaniac, an evil barbarian. He schemed to exterminate our entire people. Right? Mordechai, on the other hand, a saintly sage, a genuine, pious leader, a lover of God, a lover of his people, of humanity. He even saved the king from Bigsan and Seresh's plot to assassinate him. So it seems obvious that a decent human being should never forget that Haman must be cursed and Mordechai must be blessed. Why do you think it is that when we mention an evil person's name, we say Yamach Shema v'zichra? That person's name should be erased, should be obliterated. When we hear Haman's name, what do we do when we read the Megillah? Boo! We blot his name out. We don't want to hear the names of evil people. We don't want their names to be remembered in a positive way. We want to focus on good news. In fact, I think the litmus test when I read the news, if it's good or not, because negative news, you turn on, the headline news at the head of the hour, and you hear all this horrible stuff going on in the world, it's quite depressing. It could really pull us down. It could drag us into quagmire, into a dark place. We have to tell ourselves, what am I going to do to change it, to make a difference? So why here's the Gemara telling us that you don't know the difference between blessed as Mordechai, cursed as Haman? We should be able to do it without being intoxicated. Good question. Very good. Absolutely, Rosalind. And it seems obvious that we should never forget that Haman is cursed and Mordechai is blessed. This point the Gemara is telling us that we can't tell the difference seems a little bit absurd. Don't worry, don't leave me yet, because I still have to explain this to you. Otherwise, you're going to walk away feeling that the Gemara is a little bit misleading. The moral equations between monsters and good people, right? Even though I know that there's a lot of today with liberalism, oftentimes that line gets blurred. Maybe the more you drink, the more blurred it gets. There are people today who allow monsters to continue their horrible work. Even our government here does not have the proper moral compass to know what's right and wrong. Just because Russia was supportive of the South African, of the ANC, during a horrible, dark time, during a dark period of this country's history, does not give us the right to endorse their treatment of Ukraine today. And as much as Ukraine is a victim today, we should know our history, that Ukraine, throughout history, is a terribly anti-Semitic country. So today there are innocent victims there and we should be standing by them. But we also shouldn't forget the history. Okay, I think we have to, don't equate everything. Just because there's a Jewish president there today does not make Ukraine a holy place. Just look at their track record of how they voted at the United Nations for Israel and not for Israel. But all the times against Israel. At the end of the day, innocent victims are being hurt. We stand with the innocent victims. That doesn't whitewash Ukraine's crimes in the past. In 1942, when the Nazis invaded there, the Ukrainians were worse than the Nazis. The Nazis, the SS soldiers told the Ukrainians to finish off the Jews in Kiev and Babi Yar. So we mustn't forget the history. And we mustn't confuse good and bad. So what on earth is Gemara telling us here? Why would the Gemara tell us that we shouldn't know the difference? What is Purim itself? The very day is which we celebrate our deliverance from the vicious Haman. Right? That was the result of the courageous spiritual and political leadership of Mordechai. Last week in our shiurim we discussed how he had to push Esther and tell her it's in your hands. Why do you think you're the queen? You think you're the queen because you're so charming, you're so good looking, you're so pretty, and that's why Achashverosh selected you? No way. You are in this position to save your people. And guess what? He put her in her place. He said to her, if you don't help out, then you know what, our people, as Mark Twain put it, the mystery of the Jewish history, that somehow or other will survive. Just as Haman didn't realize the day he chose for our extinction was the yahrzeit, the passing of Moshe Rabbeinu, but it was also the day of Moshe's birth. We are a nation that follows the sun and the moon, and while the moon waxes and wanes, the sun has its consistency in the sky. It's always shining bright. The Jewish people, we have our ups and downs, but we also are an ever brightly shining light. And therefore he said to Esther, Revach v'hatzala yamad laYehudim b'makom acher. If not for you, then salvation will come from the Jews from elsewhere. V'atu v'esavich tavedu. And you and your family will be gone in history. And you know what? She took his word seriously. Right? What does she do? She says, okay, I'm in. Let's do this. Even though she knows that there's no person who survives without the king extending his golden scepter. She says, I wasn't called by my husband for 30 days. And she concludes, and we know that the tune of the Megillah is an upbeat, nice tune. It's a unique tune. And we throw in a Tisha B'Av tune there when it comes to Esther going in. She says, Chasher avadati, avadati. I know that I'm risking my life. She puts in that sad tune there. She says, I know that I'm risking my life. But it takes risking your life in order to help save another. A paramedic, a doctor, look how many people, as much as there are people leaving Ukraine, and my own family, and we have a simcha, my cousin from Ukraine got engaged yesterday, so we have a family simcha with them, but they had to escape from Kharkov because they were in such danger. Even though my cousin is a rabbi in the community, and he said he would stay, but their lives were literally at risk. Their shul windows were bombed. Their own home, they don't know what's going to happen there. That's why there's a major fundraiser going on, millions of dollars. These people left everything behind. They left with a little suitcase. They don't know if their homes are ransacked. They have no clue what's going on there. But you have to be willing to save, to risk your life. How many people from Hatzalah are flying into Ukraine to be there to help save lives? So we look at this day of Purim, and we realize that what is Purim all about? It's our salvation from the wicked plans of Haman. So how are we to make sense of the Talmud's demand that on Purim we don't know the difference between cursed be Haman and blessed be Mordechai? Of course we need to know the difference. How else will we be able to face evil and say, this is evil? If the world just stands by with Putin bombing out Ukraine, which the world is, to some degree is standing by, then we don't know what's cursed as Haman, blessed as Mordechai. And why would the Gemara tell us this if the whole idea of Purim is exactly that, to remember? So obviously there's a deeper message there. There has to be something much deeper that the Gemara is telling us. You want to know? Okay, sit back, unwind, relax, stretch yourself a bit. We have to understand this. Now the short version of the Purim story is that there was a king named Achashverosh, and he had a powerful and wicked advisor named Haman. And like we said before, this king was so foolish, he killed his first wife at the advice of his friend Haman. And he killed his friend Haman at the advice of his second wife. Foolish man. Right? One day, this rabidly anti-Semitic Haman somehow convinced the king that it would be good, it would be in his interest to wipe out, to annihilate this Jewish people. And as he presented it to King Achashverosh, he says, this peculiar people, they're a fifth column in your nation, they're different. And we discussed last week all the different allegations and accusations against us, which we won't go into today. But we know that the end of the story, they tried to kill us. What happened? A whole metamorphosis, a change of events. Jewish Queen Esther ends up with convincing her husband to save the people. Achashverosh gives us the permission to defend ourselves. Thank God we're here. Baruch Hashem, let's celebrate. But then you have the behind the scenes story, which is what we do here. And the Medrash tells us of a whole subscript that isn't mentioned anywhere in the Megillah, but that adds layers and layers of nuance, of perspective and meaning to the plot. And on Shabbos, we had a visitor, a guest at our shul. This guy, by the way, he flew in from Zambia just to hear Parshat Zachar, because he knew it was Parshat Zachar this Shabbos. It's, according to some, biblically mandated, never to forget. So he flew in for this. And he was giving us the story, and he tells us, some of the background. It was fascinating to hear. And you get the fuller picture. The first thing we need to know is the fact, and it's mentioned in the Talmud, that Mordechai was not only a leader of the Jewish people, he was a member of the Sanhedrin and the Anshe Knesset Agdola, the men of the Great Assembly. In Israel today there's the Knesset. Where does the name Knesset come from? Anshe Knesset Agdola, the men of the Great Assembly. But he was also a member of the Persian government. Even today, Iran has Jewish members of government. It seems to be enshrined in the Persian constitution that the Jewish people have to be represented in the government. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The second thing we need to know is that although Haman eventually reached the heights of power, he actually came from very lowly beginnings. And the Talmud tells us that for quite a while, Haman had a career as a barber. Okay? And he was a barber in a place called Khartoum. Says the Gemara Masechet Megillah that Haman was the barber of the village of Khartoum for 22 years. Somehow, this poor barber got himself a job in the government, and this is where he met Mordechai, long before the Purim story even took place. What happens is, Mordechai and Haman actually had a long and complicated history, and that's what makes the Purim story so complex, so interesting. And the Gemara tells us a story, an incident, an anecdote of this history of Mordechai and Haman. Says the Gemara, it happened once that the king sent Mordechai and Haman on a mission. The mission was to conquer a certain territory, and the king gave them money. Haman took his portion of the money. What did he do? Spent it. He squandered it away. When they arrived, they needed to spend the money on their mission. Haman had nothing left. Mordechai still did have his money. So Haman approached Mordechai, the Gemara tells us, and he asked him, please, lend me some of the money that you have. Mordechai said, you want me to lend you the money? There has to be an agreement made. So Haman borrowed the money and he wrote a document. The Gemara says in this document, he said, I am your servant until I pay back the money. Okay? Imagine that. For all of Haman's haughtiness, he was a barber originally. He sold himself. He was committed until he pays back Mordechai. He was subjected to him. And this was their agreement. He knew it. Mordechai knew it. And it seems like everyone else knew it in order for this to be public information. Daf Tes Vav Amud Aleph, the Gemara continues and says, in the Megillah, when Haman came to King Achashverosh, and he was complaining about the Jews, and he said, this Mordechai, lo yichrev, lo yishtachave, he will not bow, he will not prostrate before me. Now, maybe on a literal level, he's saying, everybody bows before me, I am the great Haman. But in another sense, bowing is not just literally, but figuratively, is he's not conceding to my whims, to my desires, to my commands. And he says to Achashverosh, V'chol zeh einena shavali, this is worthless to me. Says the Gemara, when Haman saw Mordechai sitting at the king's gate, he said, all the riches that I have, all my power, I am a dignitary, I'm a diplomat, I'm a big macher. What's it worth when I see this Jew Mordechai? So the Gemara explains it. Mordechai came as one with, he came with a heritage, whereas they both came with their pasts. Haman came as a barber. Mordechai came as a leader of the Sanhedrin. Okay? And now, Haman was indebted to Mordechai. And as the Talmud puts it, some people don't like being indebted. They don't like paying back favors. In fact, I remember a rabbi saying to someone once, in appreciation for the favor I did for you, he gave him some small pebbles. So the man said, why are you giving me these pebbles? He said, because some people have a custom, they pay back favors by throwing rocks on the people who are kind to them. So I'm giving you soft little pebbles so it shouldn't hurt me too badly. Haman didn't want to recognize that Mordechai was kind to him. So the Purim story takes a whole different shape and perspective when we read the Talmudic background. It's clear that Haman's eventual rise to power wasn't something to be taken for granted. On the contrary, it was quite unlikely that such a person would ever amount to anything. He was a barber, and somehow he got a position as a diplomat, and he owes a favor to Mordechai, and he feels not so good about it. Even when Haman did manage to carve out a corner for himself in the palace as the big shot that he was, first he was a minor minister. Right? He wasn't yet the viceroy that he would ultimately become. In the first part of the Megillah, when Vashti rebels against the king, when she refuses to show off her beauty, right? The king said, you come in your crown. In your crown and nothing else. In your birthday suit. So Vashti didn't want to do so. Why not? Is it because she was undignified that way? Or the Talmud says that she got a rash that day. It's part of the plot. Right? If you look at the whole story, In fact, God's name's not even mentioned. It all seems within nature. Everything's taking place. That's Megillat Esther. Megillah means revealing, besides from meaning scroll. Esther means hidden. It's revealing the hidden. Throughout the story, everything just seems like a bunch of disjointed events. All comes together. But when you get the background, when the Talmud fills us in with these details, and we see where Vashti rebels against the king, and the king is at a loss, he doesn't know how to respond. So he confers with all his ministers. And of the 7 ministers near the king, Haman, as he was known as Memuchan, he was ready for action. He's the last one listed, right? And he's the one who now throws in his 2 cents. Even though he was 7th in rank, because if you go back into the Megillah, what does it say there where the king is not sure what to do? The king was very angry, and his anger was burning within him. What does it say? King said to all his advisors, who were the known ones of his times, and what did he say to them? He asks them what to do. What are all those words? These are names of his advisors. Shiva Sarei Paras Umadai. These were the 7 advisors of the king. And he's the last one mentioned, Haman. So even though he was 7th in rank, he was the first one to reply. He's the one who gave his 2 cents. And he's the one who said to the king, what did he say? He had a brilliant information. This isn't just a crime against the king. It's against all the men of the nation that this woman, this Vashti of yours, has conspired. Right? So the Talmud tells us that in comparison to the other ministers who were present, Memuchan was basically a commoner. He was the rookie. He was a newcomer. But Haman was power hungry. So rather than sit back and let those with experience try to level-headedly resolve the issue at hand, he pushes his way to the front. He offers his free advice. And in general, we know the story about advice. It's the only commodity with more in supply than demand. So, the way the Gemara puts it, that Mikan Shehedyet Koifet Barash. We see that sometimes a fool tries to jump to the front. Now, as far as the status quo at this point in the story is concerned, everything so far, we don't yet have too much trouble from Haman. This is early on, it's the first chapter of the Megillah. Haman was a low-level minister, didn't have too much influence, so even though he's building up in his mind how he wants to build up his case, but so far we don't see yet too much trouble, too much instigation. The Jews still had their religious freedom in the first chapter. They even had their own representative in government. All in all, Jews were doing okay, and there was no reason to suspect that they would soon need to be saved from anything. Remember what things were like 3 weeks ago in Ukraine? Nah, you think that Putin is going to attack? No way. Everything's okay. Let me tell you, my mother's family came from Poland, from a little shtetl called Belz. Belz, my shtetl Belz. My mother said her family in Belz, they thought in 1938, life is okay. We don't need to go. In fact, some of them moved to Israel in the 30s, and it was hard to be a chalutz, a pioneer. Israel was a rough place in those days. My father came there in 1947 on the Exodus ship, and it was difficult. It was times of austerity, not prosperity. My father left in the early 50s and never went back. It was tough, rough times. Well, everything seemed okay, as my mother put it. Many of them felt life was better in Poland than in Palestine. What were they to know how the tide would turn, and none of those people survived? So far, everything seems fine. Then all of a sudden, Putin attacks. All of a sudden, things go crazy. Haman is appointed as this prime minister into a soaring position, right? And he convinces the king to annihilate the Jews. And within months, the Jews are starting this whole downward spiral. They're staring at destruction of their people, God forbid. Who knows what's going to be? We know at the end of the day, miraculously, the turn of events, Haman's killed and the Jews are saved. But at this point, Haman is in charge. And you look at the story. Go in fact to the 8th chapter. We're already now, right? All of a sudden the king gives the power to Mordechai. Everything is turned around. All of a sudden Mordechai, look at the very end of the Megillah, where Mordechai is already now in a position of leadership and he knows how to do the taxes and what to do. So what's the meaning of all the drama? What are we getting to? What's the point? How did this lowly, wicked Haman rise so suddenly that now he could plan the extermination of the Jewish people? And how did the Jewish people, with such a righteous, noble leader as Mordechai, how did they fall into such danger? How is it possible for a world that's seemingly stable, that's seemingly where everything seems, right? You recognize what's good, what's bad, right? Everything seems okay. All of a sudden it's turned upside down. How did we go from 3 weeks ago to now the world in war? And if we look at the story of the Megillah, we could see exactly that. How did this story, if you look at the whole story of Purim, before the Purim story, Haman was a nothing and the Jews were doing okay. After the story, Haman was gone and again we're doing okay. So what was really gained by this whole terrifying spectacle, story, the drama, the, what do you call this whole, what's it called, horror movie? Yeah? So, what was this all about? Now obviously there's a difference between pre-Purim and post-Purim, right? Because it brought us to a better place. We were elevated to a higher level there. But we really have to understand, was this whole drama just so Mordechai could become a powerful minister, as it seems to be at the end of the Megillah? Is that what it's about? Promotions, demotions. You say it's intriguing. It is. But was the whole purpose of the Purim story simply to just intrigue us? Huh? To wake us up. So we have to understand what this is all about. What's it for? There must be something deeper at play. And I want to analyze it a little bit. The Purim story is not about what position Haman or Mordechai had. It's about society's perception in general of what's wrong and what's right. Right? The point, we could talk about Haman and his position. I think an important lesson and message we have to learn from this, and why the Gemara tells us about this intoxication and not knowing the difference, is really, in society, we have to know what are the correct morals and standards, what's right, what's wrong. And I think there's important lessons that have to be learned. And when we could resolve, that we have a proper moral compass, we can have clarity of right and wrong. If we know what a Haman stands for, what's evil, what Mordechai stood for, what's right, and the wide gulf, the gap between them. Essentially, right there in the Megillah is a story of national intoxication. The world was drunk to the point that it cannot distinguish between the goodness of Mordechai and the evil of Haman. The world was at such a stage, and unfortunately sometimes I think our world today is at the same stage. So perhaps what the Gemara is telling us is that we have to wake up to a better reality. We have to understand the difference between cursed as Haman and blessed as Mordechai. Of course, on Purim, we have to distinguish between good and evil. The Gemara is not in any way insinuating otherwise. But we have to challenge ourselves and our understanding of that distinction. We have to ensure that our rejection of evil of Haman and our embrace of Mordechai, of piety, is meaningful, is real, not just following the norms of society, not just following what social media tells us. There has to be a state of ad la yada, when we forget everything we know about good and evil, so we can become open to a higher consciousness, to a higher recognition of what good and evil are, what they stand for. What is the difference? And so what's interesting is that in 1969 or 1970, when the whole hippie movement was going on, the Rebbe gave a whole talk about this. And he discussed this, the whole idea of what was going on in the world at that time, the hippie movement. Many people saw, Woodstock is a area in upstate New York where all these hippies went, and people just were free floating, what do you call it? And it was a rebellion. It was a rebellion of the youth. Hundreds of thousands of these oddly dressed hippies, and they were experimenting with all types of stuff, with drugs, with free love, right? With minds and hearts that were open to everything and anything. People said they were so open-minded that their brains fell out. Okay, the music and all the stuff that was going on then. And who remembers it? Do you remember those days? Okay, it was a whole movement. Well, how did their parents see it? If you were a youth at that time, how did your parents accept it? These guys were anti-establishment, right? This wasn't exactly something that parents embraced, to see their children acting so morally debased and abusing drugs and all these other behaviors that were not appropriate, or at least not dignified, not something the parents wanted to see their children do it. Why did an entire generation of young and bright kids, and it was going on here too, why did they reject what was normal and sensible and rational, what was the norms of society at the time? Was Vietnam what triggered it? So what was it? Just a way to break free from the norm? It was a rebellion. Very good. Rebellion. Now, was a rebellion good or bad? Depends how you look at it. So let me share it to you the way the Rebbe saw it, using the lens of the Purim story. And the Rebbe spoke about this whole Purim story and related it to the hippie Woodstock celebrations, parties of the time. And the Rebbe explained, he said that just as in the Purim story, there are two different states of differentiating between cursed is Haman and blessed be Mordechai. And we have to understand the difference. There are two levels of consciousness in which we can distinguish between cursed is Haman and Mordechai and blessed is Mordechai. What is the difference? That is what we have to know. And we have to be mindful of. From a very pragmatic and materialistic world outlook, Haman's path is evil and has to be rejected. Mordechai is righteousness, piety. That's what we have to embrace. Many parents have taught their children, if you want to get into a good college, stay away from drugs and alcohol, all the other things. There was one of the seniors told me he went to the doctor. And the doctor was checking him out. And the doctor asked him, as he was inspecting him and checking his health, he says, "Doctor, will I be okay? Will I live to at least 100? So the doctor asked him, "Do you play with drugs? Do you go out partying? Do you do this, that, the other? No, I don't smoke, I don't drink, I don't do drugs. So the doctor says, and what do you want to live to this old age for? When parents are telling the kids, if you want to make a good income, if you want to have a good life, then you know what you have to do. Be a mensch like Mordechai. Eh? Everyone will be happy with you. But if you're a Haman, you'll bring shame to yourself. You'll bring shame to your family. What a shanda. Now that's very nice, right? Certainly you can raise children who will be good, law-abiding citizens, decent human beings, hard workers, faithful to their family commitments. Very nice. And I think that's very good. But that's not what worked in the 1960s, that period of the hippie movement. There was still a major rebellion from what they called the establishment. People wanted to do things that were different, right? They embraced a different lifestyle. They wanted uncontrolled, uninhibited intimacy and acid trips and all the other fun of the time. So what went wrong? Pardon? Yeah? True. Okay? So there's no doubt that the kids had reasons to rebel. But the Rebbe explained, let me share with you since we're running low on time, but because we managed to start a little late, we had tech issues, I'll go a little late. The Rebbe explained in that talk that as good as it sounds that you're going to teach kids to be like Mordechai and to reject the Haman type of behavior, such an outlook is centered upon self-interest, personal gain. It's all about me. So I could get good grades, so I can make a good living, so I could find a nice spouse, so I could. The evil of Haman is bad for me. Right? I'll avoid it if at all possible. What just happened? Somebody just signed me out? I don't know what just happened here. Okay. It says here, and somebody's asking if there is any correlation to the tree of good and evil. We'll get back to that. That's a very good question. And it certainly does. But we'll get back to that in a moment. So, if it's all about me and how I am going to be seen, and since you're asking that question, Winston, I think it's a good question. And let me tell you why. Because the Gemara asks a question, Haman min Torah minayin, where do we find Haman in the Torah? And what is where do you find Haman in the Torah? What kind of foolish question is that? The story of Haman, the story of Mordechai and Esther, the whole Purim saga took place centuries after the whole Torah is completed. So why would the Gemara ask, where's Haman in the Torah? But the Gemara does answer. You want to know where? Hamina 8 says it. When God asks Adam, did you eat from that tree that I told you not to eat from? What has that got to do? Adam's eviction from paradise. What does that have to do with Haman in the Torah? I don't want to review a shir that I gave you guys a few weeks ago. But if you remember, I gave you a talk then about the cherubs, the Kruvim. Do you remember such a shir? I don't know if I gave it this year or last year. But it was a shir where we discussed the idea that the Kruvim that were on top of the ark, that the Kruvim, there's different meanings of the word cherubs. In Shemos and Exodus, where the Kruvim are on top of the ark, there the word cherub means beautiful, angelic, childlike face. Whereas in Bereshis and Genesis, the word Keruvim are defined as Malachi Chabala, demons, angels of destruction. What's the difference? In Shmais, it is on top, they're placed on top of the ark of the covenant. They are attached to the Torah. When you're guided by the morals and ethics, by a compass that is Torah driven, then we understand this is a proper life to be lived. We know what's the difference between right and wrong, between Haman and Mordechai. But when one says, as Adam and Eve, the whole world is before you, but all I want to eat from is the tree that's forbidden for me, then we got a problem. That is Haman in the Torah. That is a lack of self-control. That is where we have trouble. That is destructive. If it's all narcissistic, if it's all self-centered, soul is S-O-U-L. Soil is S-O-I-L. It's all about me, myself, and I. If the difference between evil and good is about how I should or shouldn't behave, because the goodness of Mordechai is good for me, and the evil of Haman is bad for me, then I'm messed up. Then I still don't know the difference between good and bad. Is that really the difference between Haman and Mordechai? If the only thing wrong with being a Haman is the fact that it will deny me a good life that I could retire in luxury, that's misplaced, right? Is it all about that I could have a nice fancy car and a nice beautiful home, that I could earn a good living? It's misguided. What about the idealistic chords in the soul of the youth? What about the passion for truth, the dedication to the human spirit? What about doing things altruistically? What about the human being's quest to touch infinity, to live a truly meaningful and spiritual life? What about that? Where is that? So the real virtue of Mordechai is about living with a true purpose, with a higher calling. We have to be a Mordechai because choosing good is the whole reason we were put here to begin with. There's a creator in this world who has a plan, and only by tapping into the divine plan does our life have value. And to be a Haman, God forbid, we have to realize what a travesty that would be, taking a human life with a God-given soul to behaviors that are hedonistic, that are just me-oriented, just about self-indulgence and pleasures. The evil of Haman has to be avoided at all costs because it negates the very essence of our existence. And so I think this is the idea that the Rebbe addressed then, that why the establishment failed the youth of the 60s. Not because it demanded too much, but because it expected too little. That's what it was. It reduced souls into machines, spirits into robots, humans capable of moral goodness into self-centered creatures. That's the difference between Mordechai and Haman. That's what they saw it as. It wasn't speaking to the profound soul of the human. It was all about what more I could get. It was all about the American dream. Right? What I could achieve, how great I could become. That's Haman. That was the cry of the people. We're not just animals searching for self-gratification, self-aggrandizement. We are souls. We care not only about a capitalistic, secure financial future, but for deep meaning. We want truth. So when the distinction between cursed be Haman and blessed be Mordechai is just based on materialistic, self-serving indulgence, of course it's wrong. We missed the point. And that's what was rejected by the youth. They didn't want that. The difference between Mordechai and Haman can't be so meaningless. There had to be something deeper to it. And so as the Rebbe spoke then, he said that was the calling of the youth. They were rejecting the superficial distinctions between Haman and Mordechai because that did not resonate with their deep, sensitive souls. Morality must speak in the name of truth and depth, not in the name of shallow, narcissistic benefits of what I can get, what's in it for me. And that's what we saw going on in the hippie movement. like in the Purim story, the erosion of moral boundaries, that was a terrifying prospect for that time. To think that people don't know the difference between what's evil and what's good. And that's what we see now too. Right? That's what we see today. So if we look back at the Purim story, the Rebbe saw a tremendous opportunity and tremendous responsibility. Look what came of the whole drama of the Purim crisis. Yes, for a time there was a breakdown of the boundaries of good and evil. But that was a crucial stepping stone. It was a springboard towards making those boundaries even stronger and more recognizable. Our responsibility is to make sure not to get stuck in the crisis. We have to realize the difference between good and evil in the real sense of it, and to learn to appreciate those boundaries, the difference of what is Haman, what is Mordechai, what they personify, what they represent. And if we could realize that difference, then we could stand in a way for a much greater and a brighter future that stands ahead. And so, if we look at what was the hippie movement, did good come out of it? I think so. The Rebbe saw it in a way that why were they rebelling against the society, the norms of the time? It was because they couldn't accept it. They wanted a better, brighter future. Something more meaningful. Have we lost it again? Probably. That's why we got to go again and try to fix the situation. Okay? That's our task in the world. But I think that's the good that could come out of it, that we could see that there is positivity. And we have to see today that although there's headlines with all types of dark news, Purim is a time to celebrate. We're not going to not celebrate because the world is going through darkness. We want to bring the light into the world. What are we going to say in the Megillah? La Yehudim haysayra v'simcha. For the Jews there was light and joy, visasa and vikar and jubilation. Right? What do we want to bring to the world? Not to focus on the darkness and negativity. We want to bring that light into the world. And that's the way the Rebbe saw the hippie movement, is that they wanted a change. They used their chutzpah to bring about change in the world at the time. They challenged the norms of their generation because they were proactive, absolutely. You know, you can't change the world by just sitting back. As the Hayom Yom we read a few days ago says, one good deed can do a lot more than 1,000 sighs. You could groan from today to tomorrow. We need less oy, but more joy. That's the goal. So regardless of who it is, we have to know what's the difference, what difference we can make in the world. The chutzpah of the youth, that might frustrate their parents, but imagine how much further they could get if they channel that chutzpah in the right way. So yes, some parents weren't happy with what they saw their kids doing. And maybe some of what those kids did was not appropriate. But they were challenging the norms of the time. And guess what we saw come from it, both in America and in South Africa and many other countries? Probably the greatest Baal Tshuva movement was then, in the late 60s and the early 70s. So many people flocked to do teshuvah. So many people changed. There was so much good that came out of that hippie movement. Why? Because they realized there needs to be some kind of a change. That's what they realized. So, were they free-spirited? Yes. Did it lead to good? Absolutely. And that, I think, the Rebbe was saying then, it's the youth who are getting things done. They got all the energy, and they were able to do so. Of course, we also have to stay young at heart. We all have that inner spark of youth inside us, and our job is to awaken that spark. Find the youth in you and ignite that passion, because that's what your Yiddishkeit needs. You need the passion, you need the enthusiasm, you need that excitement, and that's what we were trying to achieve. That's what we want to accomplish. So the lines between good and evil are so often blurred. The fabric of society is torn apart, but we have to realize it is to be re-sewn together. We need to replace the superficial boundaries with real, genuine meaning and purpose. That's the goal. That's what we need to achieve. And that, I think, is what we could learn from the hippie movement. The idea of, yes, the chutzpah of that time Why is it flying through there and not giving us? Sorry, guys. My computer's temperamental today. But I think that's the point. It's not a challenge, but a unique opportunity. And that's what we need to face. That, my friends, is a good message you can take from the Purim story, that the youth get things done and not be intimidated by the challenges. Any questions, ladies and gentlemen? Yep. Yeah. It's true. Well, we'll see. Who knows what will be. All right, ladies and gents, please come join us tomorrow morning.
Rob, are you going to do the Megillah on Zoom?
Just a second. Pardon, Ricky? Jews don't click glasses. Well, we don't click glasses. Well, it's not about a mistrust. Of course, if there's the old way was because there was a mistrust. Maybe that's why I got glass in my hand. Yeah. The question that is being asked by Mervyn is, will we have a Megillah reading online? No, you cannot be yotze to the Megillah online. Obviously, you can go online and listen to the Megillah, but we're not going to offer that because Megillah has to be done in person. So try to get to a shul on Purim and hear the Megillah in person.
Thank you, Rob.
Zai Kazan to everyone. See you tomorrow, please, God.